welcome back to my new mini-series, The Best Parts of Resident Evil. On today's episode, we're taking a look at my favorite game of the franchise, the original Resident Evil 2. Full disclosure, RE2 is actually my first ever Resident Evil game. I remember being introduced to this franchise when watching my uncle play through it on the PlayStation 1. After watching him, I had to beg my mom to get me a PlayStation so that I could play these games myself, and I started with the second game first, and well, the rest is history. Anyway, with so many iconic moments, features, and characters, there's really so much to appreciate from this game. In fact, there's so much to love about this game that it became a major challenge for me to make a top 10 best parts video on this game because of how many things I really enjoyed about it. So you'll notice that I cheated here and there with today's list by combining certain elements of the game as a single entry at certain points on this list. Still, I'm sure I forgot certain moments or there's things that you probably felt deserved a spot on this list, so be sure to leave your own opinions in the comments down below. Also, keep in mind that this video is only focusing on the original game, not the remake. That'll be a whole separate video, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, from the introduction to iconic characters to horrifying monsters, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 best parts of Resident Evil 2. Let's get it. Number 10, Zapping System. Over 25 years later, despite the overwhelming praise for one of the most iconic mechanics seen in Resident Evil 2, to this day there has still yet to be another Resident Evil game to feature the Zapping System. Hell, not even the remake of RE2 used the Zapping System to the degree of the original game. And it's a real tragedy because honestly, the Zapping System was a fantastic mechanic that added some level of replayability while also creating elements of strategy and decision making. In the original RE2, the player would come across a total of 9 situations in the game that could influence Scenario B's playthrough of Resident Evil 2. Some of the examples include the choice to leave behind either a machine gun or a side pack for Scenario B's character, which hallway shutter to use to fuse on, or choosing to release or not to release the gas in Scenario A while inside of Ness. Each of these decisions would influence how difficult or how easy certain elements of your second playthrough of the game would be. Nowadays, it might not seem like a mind-blowing mechanic, but back then, when most games were very linear, it did provide some replayability for an already fantastic game. Number 9, NPCs. Like I already teased earlier in the intro of today's video, I found myself combining certain elements of this game in order to fit them into a single entry. For example, the NPCs of Resident Evil 2. Now look, honestly speaking, each of the side characters of RE2 really deserve their own entry. However, I'm limited on space, so I decided to include all of them, all the non-playable characters of this game, as a single entry on today's list. Anyway, Resident Evil 2 is arguably one of the best games when it comes to developing and introducing side characters. Robert Kendo, a gun shop owner in Raccoon City, who is probably the funniest character of the game.
Ooh, sorry about that, babe.
In fact, he's so funny and iconic in the short amount of time that he's on screen that years later a mod was created for him. Marvin, a selfless cop who aids either Claire or Leon in escaping the station by giving them access to other rooms via a card. Annette Birkin, a complicated villain that you ultimately find yourself hating and feeling bad for at the same time after learning about her throughout the game. Chief Irons, the corrupted chief of police who's done horrible things, making him almost a more despicable villain than William Birkin himself. Overall, while not as iconic and memorable as the main characters and the main villains of the game, the side characters of Resident Evil 2 were some of the best parts of the entire game. Number 8, the Lickers. While the first game had hunters, Resident Evil 2 introduced the Lickers. These creatures were similar to hunters in terms of their ability to leap and decapitate the player, but were far more disturbing and disgusting in appearance. Lickers were actually at one point a zombie, but after feeding a lot, some zombies would mutate into a new monster by shedding off its skin. On top of that, they would gain large claws and a longer tongue. Overall, the Licker was the most terrifying monster of Resident Evil 2, even more so than Mr. X and William Birkin. As a matter of fact, one of the most memorable scenes for most of us was our introduction to the Licker. It started with drops of blood dripping from the ceiling into a puddle of blood. Then, as we get closer to the blood, we'd see a skinless monster licking its lips before leaping down to the floor and attacking us. Lickers were so iconic that we would see variations of them in future games, including Resident Evil 5 and even molded versions of them in Resident Evil 7. Still, nothing will ever compare to our first encounter with the Licker back in Resident Evil 2. Number 7. The Fourth Survivor. So many fan favorites of the franchise were introduced in Resident Evil 2. Leon Kennedy, Claire Redfield, even the mysterious Ada Wong. However, it wasn't just the characters of the main game that became fan favorites. After beating the main game, Resident Evil 2 also featured 2 bonus modes, the Fourth Survivor and Tofu Survivor. Sure, Tofu Survivor was a combination of a joke and a more difficult bonus game for players looking to test their skills, but the Fourth Survivor introduced one of the biggest fan favorite characters of the franchise despite it being a bonus game. I mean, this was our first introduction to the Grim Reaper himself, Hunk. Taking place during the events of Resident Evil slightly before Leon Claire's arrival, Hunk would be tasked with retrieving the G-Virus and escaping Raccoon City. It's a quick bonus game in which Hunk will need to quickly face off against a ton of enemies and monsters before finding his way out of the city. The mysterious, faceless character of Hunk in the Fourth Survivor became so iconic that he would later return in multiple Resident Evil games as a playable skin for mercenaries and other spin-off entries. Number 6. Ada Wong and Sherry Birkin. Earlier I covered the side characters as a single entry on this list, but I specifically used the term NPCs for a reason. That's because I felt like that the 2 supporting playable characters of the game, Ada Wong and Sherry Birkin, deserve their own spot on today's list. For Ada, she was introduced as a character searching for her boyfriend, John. Almost immediately, Ada came off as mysterious, and honestly that was a major reason why a lot of us fell in love with her so quickly. The mysterious and darker side of Ada kept us intrigued by her character throughout the entire game. What is her motivation? Why is she here? Does she actually care about Leon or not? All of these questions ran through our minds at different moments throughout the game. And despite her betraying us, we all felt it in our hearts when we thought she had died. And to think, her character would only improve from here in future games. As for Sherry, while not as great as Ada Resident Evil 2, she still made her mark. Keep in mind that for a time, this was a kid who somehow managed to survive an outbreak when cops, soldiers, and other adults were being killed all over the city. On top of that, she managed to hold her composure multiple times despite her father becoming a monster who was obsessed with creating offspring with her. Yeah, that's kind of disturbing. Either way, both Ada and Sherry were some of the most interesting supporting characters of not only the franchise, but in survival horror games as a whole. Number 5. The main villains, William Birkin and Mr. X. Considering that the main villain of the game is dependent on which scenario you are playing, I decided to include both William Birkin and Mr. X as a single entry on this list. And to be fair, they both are extremely different yet satisfying as a villain in different ways. For William Birkin, it's his story and his motivations. As a scientist obsessed with his research on the G-Virus, he was willing to sacrifice everything to protect his work. And when he faced death, he injected himself with the virus in order to get revenge on Umbrella and stop them from taking his precious G-Virus. Throughout the course of the game, we face off against Birkin multiple times as we slowly watch him transform into something more disturbing each time we face off against him. With each transformation, he departed farther from his humanity before eventually becoming the blob creature that we saw at the end of Scenario B. Watching his transformations throughout the game and learning of his story made him one of the best villains of the franchise. However, that's not to say that Mr. X didn't make for a great villain as well. As the main antagonist of Scenario B, Mr. X was technically the first ever stalker enemy in the Resident Evil franchise. Yeah, even before Nemesis. But due to Mr. X being hidden in a second playthrough of the game, a lot of us didn't even know he existed at first. As a relentless pursuer, Mr. X would consistently show up at random times to stop the player in their tracks. While Birkin was a better villain overall, Mr. X added a new level of unpredictability to the game that would later inspire the creation of the most iconic stalker enemy in video games, Nemesis. Number 4. The best soundtrack in Resident Evil. Perhaps I'm letting nostalgia get the best of me here, but to this day I can't think of a better video game soundtrack than Resident Evil 2. There are so many iconic tracks that are played during certain moments of the game that really hit hard for me. Seriously, not even Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil Code Veronica, or even Kingdom Hearts can compare to a soundtrack as fire as Resident Evil 2. I mean, just to name a few, you have the main hall of the RPD Station. boss fight against Super Tyrant. But personally, one of the most iconic and my favorite track of the game is of course the save room theme. In fact, I love this theme so fucking much that I literally use it as my background music in all of my videos on the channel, including this video right now. Seriously, the soundtrack of this game rules, and I dare you to name a game with a better soundtrack than Resident Evil 2. Go ahead, hit up the comments, I double dare you. Number 3, the RPD Station. While not as iconic as the Spencer Mansion of the original game, the RPD Station is probably the most recognizable setting for casual fans of the series. Hell, outside of the Spencer Mansion, the RPD Station has probably the most recognizable floor plan for a location throughout the entire franchise. And for a good reason. Firstly, taking a place where you're supposed to feel safe and secure, and then turning it into a nightmare was one of the most brilliant decisions made by the team behind Resident Evil 2. However, a simple police station as the main setting for a horror game wouldn't suffice. No, they would need to find a way to make it more interesting in order for it to compete with a Spencer Mansion. So how did they do that? Well, the RPD Station used to be an old art museum that was later repurposed for a police station. This added a unique flair and aesthetic to the police station that allowed it to feel different and unique enough to be the main setting of a horror game. Because of this, we were introduced to some of the more memorable and iconic rooms of Resident Evil 2. This also allowed the RPD Station to have puzzles, creepy artwork, and statues scattered throughout the station to make it feel more appropriate for a horror game. The Spencer Mansion may be the most iconic location in a horror game, but the RPD Station makes a strong case for the second most iconic location in a horror game. Number 2, A and B scenarios. Earlier on this list, I was talking about the Zapping System and how it created a little bit of replayability. Well, there was one other feature in the game that definitely added replayability, and it did so in a much bigger way. That of course was the A and B scenario system. See, in the original Resident Evil, we experienced the original nightmare of the Spencer Mansion from the perspective of two separate characters, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. However, outside of the interaction they had with either Barry or Rebecca, not much really changed. The puzzles were all the same, the story was mostly the same, and it wasn't two separate perspectives technically, as in each playthrough the other main character was just locked away the entire time. However, Resident Evil 2 changed that completely. Instead of just playing the same game with two different viewpoints, RE2 introduced the A and B scenario. What this meant is that you would play the game once as either Leon or Claire. This will give you the starting point of the streets farther from the station, which will allow you to interact with Robert Kendo, Marvin, and possibly Zombie Brad. The main villain of this scenario would be William Birkin, and a majority of the boss fights would be against him. However, after beating the game, you would then play scenario B as the other character. This route will stop you from meeting Marvin and Kendo, but you'll be able to see the chopper crash into the police station. Also, instead of Birkin as the main villain, Mr. X will follow you throughout the game. And unlike RE1, a majority of the puzzles in the RPD Station would also change, making the gameplay different as well. On top of that, even the scenes would be different depending on which character does which scenario. For example, Ada's death is completely different based on if you're playing as Leon in scenario A or Leon in scenario B. This motivated the player to play the game not twice, but 4 times to experience every single scene that the game had to offer. The A and B scenario system was without a doubt one of the best mechanics seen in a Resident Evil game, and it's a damn shame that it was never used again, not even in the remake. Number 1, Leon and Claire. One major issue with the original Resident Evil was the fact that neither Jill or Chris was interesting characters in the slightest. And this is coming from someone whose favorite character of the franchise is Chris Redfield. However, it's not until later versions of these characters that both Chris and Jill really stand out as being interesting and iconic characters. In my opinion, Leon and Claire in Resident Evil 2 is the best pair of main characters for a single game out of the entire franchise. Each one of them stands out as being the most interesting characters of their respective scenarios. Leon, a rookie cop on his first day on the job, and Claire Redfield, a loyal and loving sister who searches for her missing brother, each grab the attention of the player from the start of the game. Leon of course starts his long history of one-liners in this game with some hilarious quotes from our favorite rookie cop.
It's good to see you're still among the living. Oh boy. Is it just me, or does everybody always ignore what I say?
His naive and trusting demeanor and his will of always wanting to do the right thing leads the player into rooting for him throughout every step of the game. Claire's motherly instincts towards Sherry and her willingness to go through heaven and hell in order to save Sherry perfectly illustrates how caring of a character she is as well. And of course, you can't forget how badass each of these characters truly are and what they managed to accomplish throughout their nightmare in Raccoon City. Overall, Claire and Leon are one of the best pairs of main characters seen in the franchise. That's evident in the fact that not only do we see them together in RE2, but we see them brought together multiple times in the CGI movies. Sure, their partnership may not be as iconic and as strong as Chris and Jill, but they definitely played a major part in making Resident Evil 2 my favorite video game of all time. But that's it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Are the main characters of Resident Evil 2, Leon and Claire, the best part of the game, or is there something else that you think deserves that title? Also, let me know in the comments below if you think I forgot anything important regarding the best parts of this game. Trust me, there's a lot to love about this game, so I wouldn't be surprised if I missed something important. Also, don't forget to watch the other episodes of this mini-series. As of recording this video, I currently have 2 other episodes out that focus on RE0 and the original Resident Evil 1. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.